Welcome to the Power of One. Today we are going to be speaking with KJ from KYW. KJ is the most dynamic reporter that I have ever met, one of. She's no nonsense, and she always gets the story right. With me being in victim services, I've always asked the question, are we talking to the shooter? KJ is boots on the ground. She has been in neighborhoods that you and I are probably afraid to go in, and she was talking to some shooters. So, KJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Melanie.
Your podcast was amazing. It not amazing in the sense that we shouldn't be alarmed at what was in the podcast, but you were able to uncover some great information to where we can begin to help those who have been affected by the streets and they feel as though they have to have these guns to survive.
One gunshot can reverberate through a neighborhood, a city, and can have a lasting impact on communities.
I'd rather see you and visit you behind bars than go to your grave site and visit you in the ground.
Families have been torn apart.
And it's a generation that come in, and then it's a generation that die off, and then it just becomes the same cycle.
As moms, sometimes we know when our kids are heading down the wrong path.
The story that broke my heart, Tavon Johnson. Did I get that right?
Tavon Thomas. Yeah.
Thomas. Tavon Thomas. Just tell the viewers, just give them a little snapshot of Tavon's life from what you knew to where he actually committed murder and then took his life.
So this is the first episode of the 5-part series, and it focuses on two people, Nicolette Rivera and Tavon Thomas. And Tavon was somebody who had just been through a lot in his life. And this is, when you're in court, you're hearing facts. This is the facts as the lawyers know them. There's something called a pre-sentence investigation anytime something happens. So this is done by outside sources that, interview not only the defendant, but then also other people. They verify information. And so we learned that with what happens kind of in this podcast, Tavon grew up not well loved at all. His uncle, when he was about 2 years old, put him in a pot of boiling water. The way that his attorney says was that his uncle was mentally infirmed. We never got really exactly what that was, but there was maybe some sort of mental disability, something like that. But he put him in a pot of boiling water. It caused scarring all over his body, including his face, very severely. The story goes on, from, again, the lawyers and the prosecutors, that he just through his life was neglected, abused by his parent, by his mother who was there. There were sometimes they didn't eat at any given time, like for weeks at a time, sometime, unless they went to school. There was also his mother called him Freak. He was known as Freak. So there was really never love in his life. But what his defense attorney said was that he really loved his siblings. Like that was where his love was for his siblings. And so we are kind of hearing this background story, and obviously it comes to a point that involved a 2-year-old girl. Tavon had just been through drugs and had assault at some point, went to mental health facility, but he just really couldn't get out of the world of violence, if you will, like that, was kind of encapsulated by it. And he, ends up having this encounter.
So he was in the system. Now, Tavon, did he have mental issues himself?
They wouldn't specify exactly what it was, but he did have essentially depression. Kind of learning through this podcast, somebody could make an argument that most shooters, and I hate to use that just as like a grouping, as a way to group them, but most people who shoot or fire shots are usually in some way depressed or suicidal themselves. There's obviously like not a compassion for life, in the way that most people feel, this, sense of survival mode. There's not that. They're not really afraid to be shot back or shot at. Anyway, but he was somebody who had dealt with depression for a very long time, mental health issues, had gone to a mental health facility, tried to get treatment by orders of judges through multiple charges and convictions that he had, but kind of it all failed. He was about 26 years old when he got wrapped up in what happened. And so we, roll back to Nicolette Rivera was a 2-year-old. This was before COVID. Nicolette was in the arms of her mother just one day, and a carpet cleaner came, and it's a very sweet story that her mother, Joan, tells us about just how she was kind of princess of the household, ran the household, for them. But essentially, Nicolette Rivera gets shot in the head as a 2-year-old, killed instantly. And it was at the hands of Tavon Thomas. And we learn obviously what precipitated that through the crime world, but he was so ridden by guilt. He went in and he kind of pled immediately to everything, said, "This was me, I did it." There was never really he waived his preliminary hearing, which is a big deal, meaning a big deal in the sense of the court, where it's kind of starting to move the process along of taking responsibility for actions. It got to the point where he just wanted to plead guilty. And then we learn during this guilty hearing, amazingly, Nicolette's mother accepted his apology and said that she forgave him. And then 2 weeks after that, we learned that Tavon killed himself in prison.
So let's go back a little bit, KJ. So Tavon, was he of the streets? Was he in a gang?
So one of the things that we've learned through this entire podcast is that most of the people that fire shots are part of what they would say is a gang. We sometimes will hear this term group violence.
Mhm.
Prosecutors just say call it a gang, because in the end, it really is just it's not Crips or Bloods. It's very much based on neighborhoods, sections of the city that you may be from, and there's long time beefs that have happened between different groups. He was a section of Germantown. He was essentially a part of a group that was involved in selling drugs. And with that, comes violence and robbery. And so he felt very, and this is, of course, from his defense attorney, but he felt very betrayed by the group that he was involved with, that they didn't take care of him when he got locked up. So that he was going out to kind of seek revenge for not being taken care of. And that's when he fired at the house that Nicolette was in.
Now, when he was going back to take revenge, so he was taking revenge on the group that he was actually a part of, because he felt like their loyalty was not with him when he got locked up.
And it wasn't just him. There was another person in the car too. But yes, essentially that's the basics of it, is that they
Okay.
didn't feel taken care of. They didn't feel that they were bailed out or helped in any way, that they were just kind of let to go, rot in jail for a couple of years. What's kind of incredible is that, just in the small world of Philadelphia, when I went to go speak to somebody else who he calls himself Uptown, and he lives there in Germantown, he told me that he knew Tavon very well, and that he felt that Tavon was a good-hearted man. And that's the thing I think that we lose a lot of times when we tell these stories. It's really hard to get what your who a defendant is at the onset of a crime.
Mhm.
Obviously, you as a victim's advocate know that a lot of obviously the information is coming from the victim. That's where kind of the care and compassion, everything goes, is to the victim. But when you get into the crime, into the court system years later or even months later, you end up understanding more about the defendant, where they came from. And Melanie, I have to tell you, I can't remember a time, at least in the top of my head, of all the years I've been doing this, where I don't sit in a sentencing hearing for a homicide or a shooting that happened where I don't hear about trauma, mental health,
Mhm.
some version of abuse or neglect or something along those lines as they're growing up. And And it may be a situation where a lot of these defendants are, you know, not understanding necessarily the recourse of what their actions were, not understanding where that will lead them in life. They know they're there and they don't want to be there. They don't want to go to jail. And the other thing that is a really important part of the story too is when I spoke to Uptown is, and I've heard this from a couple of defendants and people involved in that world, is that prison is where people go to sharpen their skills or to more maybe make divides and make alliances with certain groups and certain gangs.
Mhm.
So while we're focusing so much on the outside of prison walls, you know, if I had to, I tell people this all the time, if I had to pick a spot, you know, obviously we would try outside, you know, with the youth and with, you know, kids growing up and whatnot, but I would say there really needs to be a focus of what happens inside prison walls as well.
I was just floored. And when you were speaking to Uptown, and he spoke about his life and how his mother used drugs, and basically he had to fend for himself. He had to feed himself. So he got into a little bit of trouble. And he was saying, I'm not my rap sheet. So don't look at me like I'm my rap sheet. But now he has this rap sheet and he cannot carry a firearm. And he's carrying his firearm to protect himself because he says in these groups, so we won't call them gangs, in these groups, you kill one group member, they're coming to kill your group member, and it's on and on. It's a never-ending cycle. So he's saying that if they know I'm of a group and I can't carry a gun, now I got to wear a bulletproof vest just to survive. This just boggled my mind. So you have these children, young adults, young African American men who are afraid for their lives just because they associate with someone else. They could lose their life just by walking to the corner store.
You know, one of the other things is too is that they can, by not having an association, you're in equal amounts of danger. I mean, you know, if you don't have, because they may not know who you are, you know, so they may not know that maybe you're in their neighborhood or around their corner or something. And we ran into somebody, a colleague of mine and I ran into somebody who was just moved here from Baltimore in Cortho on crutches, had just been shot, but also was there because he had a gun and he was locked up for having a gun. But he was shot at because, I mean, he believes that it was because nobody knew who he was because he came to Baltimore, so that he was thought to be with another group. So obviously it's predominantly African American men between the ages of about 18 and 35. But if you really look at it, it's even more like 18 to 24, and if not younger. And the statistics are showing us that it's more kids that are not only also being shot, but are also being locked up. They say kids 18, 17, 16, 15. This weekend we had 2 teenagers that were shot. It's very concerning. And, you know, just a shout out to you. You introduced me to episode 2's subject, Andrea, who goes into all of what it took to try and get her child off the street and how that ended. She did everything she could think of to try and get him out of that situation. Everything.
She did. Now, and I'm sorry not to cut you off, like Andrea and I love her, and she actually opened up and told more of her story, in which my son's nickname was Shooter, but she said, I raised my son to be that thug. So we had that unbelievable conversation where she said when he was like 5 or 6, and we would take pictures, and she said, I'm pulling down this pit, show your boxers, put your middle finger up. And she admitted that she did some things that her children saw, and she knows that resulted in Jermaine's lifestyle. Now I want to go back for a minute to Tavon, and not saying Tavon is a bad person. That's not what I'm saying. Here it is, Tavon is thinking that he is getting ready to shoot someone from his group who he felt was not loyal to him. And instead, he shoots a 2-year-old baby, which is devastating. I don't even know how that mom is still standing. And Tavon feels very bad about that. Now, KJ, help me to understand, and I don't know if you can. A life is a life. I don't care whether you're 2 or 92. How could you go on and not feel remorse for killing somebody who's 22, 32, 42, 52, 62? You understand what I'm saying to you? But you felt real bad in taking the life of a 2-year-old, as you should. But the part I don't understand, KJ, and again, I don't know if you can help me understand this. Who were you to take somebody's life?
So many people have asked me that throughout this. I mean, not asked me that, I mean, obviously rhetorically, but have asked that throughout this podcast series. How do you lay your head down at night? How do you think about this? And I think that it's a different mindset. It's a different world. It's a different thought process. And it's kind of a little bit of and Scott speaks a little bit to this too. There's a little bit of nobody cares about me, so I don't care about anybody. And, Scott says in this, it's getting them at that exact point of fear, when they have an exact moment of fear, and then trying to get them veer off the path of right into the right direction, if you will, trying to get that moment of fear and then try and pounce on it to get them on the right track of life into moving away from that. But, one of the things that Uptown told me that I thought was very interesting, and I had never thought about it before, but he talks about in this first episode, is that not only was he not allowed to have a gun, obviously because he had previously been arrested for one, but then he tried to wear body armor, and he was also arrested for wearing body armor. So he said, it feels like they just want me to die because I can't wear body armor. I'm not allowed to. And I was arrested for that, but I'm also not allowed to carry a gun. And I just think that's really interesting because he lives in a neighborhood where there is just a lot of gun violence. I mean, where we were, there was another 6-year-old that was shot about 7 years ago or so. And I remember being on that street when that 6-year-old was shot. And that's what made me think of it. And I was like, wait a second, is this? And it was. And so, he's right there kind of in the center of it. And yet there's no safety measures for him. I mean, and I think that's how so many neighbors in this city feel right now, is that if you are out, you are a target, or you could be a target. But I think even getting it further down the line into exactly what's happening, it's looking at the whole scope, the whole mindset of the predominant group that is not only being shot, but also creating a lot of the violence happening, and what's happening in their lives. What are the patterns? What's going on, that creates this?
Did you happen to speak to someone who is not necessarily in a group, but decides they want to rob someone? Someone still gives you their belongings, but they can still lose their life. I just don't get it, KJ. We're not asking the question, what do you need, or what happened to you when they get before that judge, when they're sentencing them. I get that part. And I'm not mad at Uptown. I'm not saying, I hope he has not taken anyone's life. It's not what I'm saying. But his thing was, and this is what he said, I got to eat and I got to feed my family. So nobody's going to get in between me and my bread. That's what he said. So, and I used to sometimes say, drug dealers, are they selling drugs because they have to or because they want to? We're going to go to these robbers or carjackers. I just don't understand for the life of me. How you going to come take what I had? Mind you, I don't have a lot. You know what I mean? I live in the same neighborhood that you live in. And I work hard for what I have. Why are you taking my stuff? And then again, some people give them the material things that they're going after, whatever that is, or whether it's money, and they kill them.
It's one of those things. I mean, I can't get into the exact psychology because obviously you and I both can't. I mean, it's understanding that mindset, but there is, we later talk to psychologists down the line who talk about kind of that group mentality, right? Like that mob mentality but this is what they see, this is what they're involved in. And there was I'll say a very famous case years ago that I covered where there was somebody who was literally sent out to the street corner by his uncles to go and sell drugs when he was a kid, basically, and was told like, this is how you're going to eat tonight, essentially. And so I think there's a little piece of that. Everybody that I talked to in this podcast seemed to have kind of, or I don't want to say point to a different piece of why
Hmm.
necessarily. I think it's a little bit of everything. I would talk to defense attorneys. What's your take on this? Why do you think this may be happening? Why do you think someone's using a gun to, commit a robbery, carjacking, shootings? Like, why do you think this is? And they had a variety of different reasons. People would say parenting, people would blame drugs, people would blame, music. I mean, there's been a lot of things, right? But it comes down to peer pressure. And I think in general, teenagers, regardless, this is my own perception. This is entirely my own perception, but teenagers always want to belong. And so no matter what it is, right? And this is just the teenagers part, but you want to belong to something. And so when you don't belong, there was actually a father of a victim that I spoke to who told me that his son was so embarrassed that his parents were married because of where they grew up. That his parents were, he was very embarrassed that his parents were marrying together because the kids apparently were making fun of him because their parents weren't together. And he kind of, I guess, would say something like, why do you have to be together? That type of thing. I think it's just kind of kids want to belong. And I say kids, again, teenagers,
Right,
young,
right,
right? They
right,
feel like kids, but they want to belong to something. They don't want to stand out. They don't want to be an outsider in any way. Obviously, getting money and those nonprofits and the programming and the football, that those are bonding experiences. Those are places where kids can belong and they can belong together, if you will, and be involved in the same type of thing. But I think a lot of victims out there feel very much like you do, where work very hard for our money and here you are stealing it or doing something
right,
with. I mean, personally, I just had a scamming incident that happened to me on Facebook, and I felt very much the same way. Like I work very hard for everything that I
right,
have, and
right,
and you just try to get, like $100 out of me. That's a
right,
lot for me,
right. I know that's
That's
right.
not a
Yeah,
drop in the bucket for me. And I think that that's how a lot of people feel is they work very hard for their money, and why can't you go and do X, Y, and Z? Why can't you go
exactly.
get a job?
Right.
Um, and I think that there are different reasons for that. I mean, I've seen that in court where there's been, I remember a teenager from, I think it was a South Philly High who doesn't have not only new clothes, but clean clothes. I mean,
Hmm.
he doesn't have there's no laundry facility in his house or where he lives at all. So he can't really go get a job. He was, holding people up at gunpoint and robbing them. And it's again a little bit of mindset, but I think it's also a little bit of need out there. And there was an effort to try and get him hooked up with somebody who could help him progress through life, maybe get that part-time job, knows a place where he could go to a laundromat to get clean clothes to be able to get to that job. So it's about like, and one of the judges we talked to in a later episode also mentions this. It's about getting the bare necessities for people to be able to get a job, a license, maybe, some version of transportation, whether that's with SEPTA or, whatever, a car, taxi, Uber, whatever, to get to a job. So to understand how to fill out a job application. I mean,
Right,
these are things that
right.
we may all take for granted, but those are little bits and pieces that they use in this one program called the Gold Ring Initiative that a bunch of Penn graduate students help people re-enter society by
Hmm.
getting these little pieces that can help them at least try and be successful.
Right.
I
And
mean,
get them off the street.
right. I mean, you have to be able to sit through a job interview, right? And
Right,
talk about, just, what your goal is or, what your best characteristics are. And if you have none of that, if you don't have any self-confidence or any, self-esteem or know what you're good at or know where
right.
you want to be, if you have no hope, then it can be very difficult, I think, for a lot of,
Yeah.
again, these kids. I call them kids.
KJ, at the end, do with all of your findings and research, are there solutions for these young people? And I heard what you just said, and which is one great solution. But did you have a solution for these young people?
I think Philadelphia wants one solution, or not only Philadelphia, I'm just speaking about our city. There are so many solutions that we need to work on and so many things that we need to unpack. I mean, we talked to somebody in the DA's office who deals with this, with the gun violence task force, who says that this is years and years of trauma and poverty and racism wrapped up into one thing that you have to try and unpack, untangle, heal, restore. And it's not going to be, the Band-Aid over the bullet hole. It's going to be about stopping those bullets from actually firing. And that's going to possibly take years.
Mm.
They're really focused, I know, on law enforcement as a whole is very focused on, I want to say, the rings or the groups, because they think that within those, they can kind of maybe stop them and track them down. One of the things, though, that's happened even through this podcast that they're realizing is that now other groups are forming that they don't know about. So there'll be, somebody from Group A is now forming an alliance with somebody from Group B, which then forms another Group Z, or something. But I think between kind of all of the efforts of everybody I think sometimes just acts of kindness also help, of just being noticed, like these little things that people do, that teachers do, or you do as a victim advocate, or whatever you can do to kind of help somebody out and get them. It's not going to happen all the time, right? There's a lot of trauma. They need therapy. People need therapy. They need to be able to have a safe space to talk about the things they've seen, the impact that they've had. But of course, the thing that all these city officials talk about is money to these programs. And you can throw money at all this stuff, but until you really get to the heart and the root causes of this, and everybody's different, I mean, Andrea's story was very different than maybe, Uptown's story. There's similarities there, but everybody is different. And so I think mentorship is a huge thing. Kids need to be, I'm sure you see it all the time. Kids need to be able to feel seen, to be heard, thought of, cared for in some way. And one of the biggest things that I took away from this is that parents, and this comes a little bit from Andrea too, parents need to be cared for. Parents need, it's that oxygen mask on an airplane. You need to put the oxygen mask on first. So you need to deal with your grief, your trauma, all the things you've been through before you can turn and help your child get through something.
I agree. Thank you so much for all that you do. And I want to thank you for telling the story the way it is, the true way. Thank you so much, KJ.
Thanks, Melany.
Thank you so much for joining me today. And please do not think I sit here and judge, because I don't. Please do not think I don't have family members that have served time in prison, because I do. I had an uncle who was murdered at the age of 22, who was selling drugs in another territory, was one of my cousins. That cousin told me, and that cousin, I would always wonder why that cousin got in trouble. And I asked him, why did you start selling drugs? Why did you start robbing people? And he said to me, Melany, when we was in junior high school, I would get talked about and teased all the time because my clothes came from the supermarket. And then I found this friend who was just holding some bags of weed for somebody else, and he would get paid. He said, I started doing that. So I would leave my mom's house, which is my aunt. I would leave that house one way, but I would get to school another way. Now, before he started selling drugs or being the watch person, he was getting talked about and beat up all the time. And now he's labeled as an angry child, because then he would start fighting back. But then he started to sell drugs and dress differently. And that changed his life, and he liked that lifestyle. So I just ask that you think about your family, your friends, and know there are people out here who really care about you. Peace and love.